Okay, great. Looks like everyone has joined us in the main room. So let's go ahead and get started. My name is Robbie Brown. I work for Acterra. I'm the Community Engagement Associate. Thanks for joining us today on Earth Day for our Silicon Valley Green Team Network Spring 2021 Forum, Organizational Climate Action with Plan C Advisors. If you're unfamiliar with Acterra, we're an environmental nonprofit based in the Bay Area, and we are really driven by environmental problems that are occurring locally and globally, and primarily the problems that have resulted due to climate change. We like to engage our local communities, companies, and agencies here in the Bay Area. And historically, we've been kind of hyper-focused in Santa Clara and San Mateo counties. However, we're spreading out and we're more Bay Area wide now. We have a wide variety of programming under the categories of electrification, food sustainability, workplace sustainability, and education. This specific program, the Silicon Valley Green Team Network, falls under workplace sustainability. If you haven't heard of this network, we're essentially comprised of volunteer representatives and sustainability professionals from a company or organization who strive to increase sustainability within their workplace. If you'd like to join our network, membership is free. You get access to our LinkedIn page, our resource center, our speaker database, and our green vendor list. And Patty Christopherson, one of my teammates, will be posting relevant links as I'm going through this slide deck. We'd like to thank LinkedIn for their continued support in sponsoring Acterra's Silicon Valley Green Team Network. We'd also like to give a special shout out to Plan C Advisors for sponsoring this particular event. They're a Bay Area-based consultancy that equips business leaders to drive climate action in their organizations. Before we begin, I want to mention just a few events that Acterra have coming up. The next one will be on April 28th at 11 p.m. PDT. This is a free event. In fact, all the events I'm going to be bringing up are free. Join us for a conversation about the impact and effectiveness of individual actions when combating our global climate crisis. This virtual coffee hour is with Acterra's Executive Director, Lauren Weston, and Bi Hui Ye. She's one of our panelists for today. From May 1st to May 31st, we have a free challenge that we encourage all of you to sign up for. We all have a part to play in shaping a sustainable future. So start by making changes to your diet that are healthier for you and for the planet. This challenge is kind of fun and unique in the sense that it's open to all ages and all eating styles. You can even personalize your approach based on your own comfort level. What we're really trying to promote and encourage is to consume a little bit less meat and more plants. On May 11th at 2 p.m. PDT, we have our Green at Home EV Charging Steps to Electrify the Home event. Learn about electric vehicle charging and how to install charging stations in your home. So again, this is May 11th at 2 p.m. PDT. And then we have the last lecture for our 4-part lecture series for spring 2021. This is about performance and impact with the UN SDG and ESGS with Nitesh Dalab. So I'm going to hand it off to our keynote speaker in just a minute. But before I do, I want to briefly talk about the agenda. So I'm going to be handing it off to Amanda North, the founder and CEO of Plan C Advisors. And then we're going to hear from our panelists as well. So Tracy Aikens, Bi Hui Ye, and then Carrie Haley. After their presentations, we're going to have a very short, about 20 to 25-minute Q&A session. I encourage all of you to submit any questions that you may have for our speakers today by using the chat box, and Patty or I will try our best to address those questions in that short period of time. After the Q&A session, we'll be breaking out into breakout sessions where we're encouraging our guests to divide into groups to creatively and strategically think of ways to incite organizational climate action based off of Plan C's holistic framework, which they'll be talking about. We'll have Acterra staff in most of those breakout rooms to help guide discussion, but Amanda North and the panelists will be in there as well. And then when you join those breakout rooms, please volunteer one person to take notes, because we're going to come back to the main room after, and we would like to hear from each group and some of the key takeaways from your guys' discussion. So after those key takeaways, we'll have a few closing remarks, and then we'll be done for the day. So Amanda North, she is the founder and CEO of Plan C. Again, she's going to start this forum by providing a holistic framework for organizational climate action. And just a little bit about Amanda before I hand it off to her. She believes that business must play a central role in creating a more just and sustainable world while providing exceptional results for stakeholders. Amanda puts this philosophy to work every day as a founder and CEO of Plan C Advisors, which, as a reminder, is a global consultancy that equips business leaders to catalyze climate action in their companies. Throughout her consulting work, board roles, and volunteer activities, Amanda leverages her expertise on board strategy, value creation, and risk mitigation relating to climate impact and ESG. She's an experienced, innovative, and collaborative executive, having served C-level roles with B2B and B2C industry leaders in fast-growth startups. Her core competencies include corporate strategy, purpose exploration, stakeholder engagement, building strategic alliances, and scaling companies. She's especially skilled at guiding organizations through key inflection points, including company launches, mergers, and IPOs. Amanda, please feel free to take it away, and I'm about to share your slide deck. Just give me 1 second.
Well, you don't need to go quite into the slides as yet, Robbie, but thank you. Okay. And thank you for that great introduction. Hi, everybody. And I just can't tell you how pleased we are to be here today, speaking for my colleagues and myself. Earth Day, wow. You know, over 50 years ago, this was started. And I don't know, I hope back then they were aspirationally thinking that we'd be where we are today. But I think for some of us who've been involved in the climate area for a while, it's kind of breathtaking, isn't it, that we're here on a day when our president has announced a desire to cut our emissions by 50% by the year 2030. Who would have thought 6 months ago, a year ago, that we'd be hearing that? It's just music to all of our ears, I think. But you know, maybe it doesn't take us by surprise, because I think those of us in Silicon Valley here, and all myself and my 3 colleagues today are all based here in the Bay Area, have worked with a number of Silicon Valley companies and organizations over our careers. We're optimists. We believe in change. We believe in driving change. And as you heard Robbie say, I really bring the notion that business leaders and businesses, organizations have the opportunity to really drive change. I've seen that in some of the extraordinary organizations that I've been very, very pleased to be part of, including Apple in the early days. But my background actually before that was in clean energy. And many of you may not remember this, but there was another wave of clean energy in the late 70s and early 80s. And that's when a lot of the early wind and solar projects and a lot of excitement over how we could have public-private partnerships to drive clean energy development. And then it stalled for a lot of different reasons. And that took me actually into a very long and productive career in high tech. But my first passion always has been about clean energy, renewables, how to make the world more sustainable. And I'm just delighted because 2 years ago, I founded Plan C because I was really frustrated with what I saw as the lack of attention at the board level and at the senior executive level for having climate as a focus. If you look at surveys done by, you know, the conference board group or other groups looking at board leaders, it really wasn't even a topic. So I'd like to first explore a little bit what has changed, because maybe part of what my colleagues and I can do today is help you understand a little bit of what the impetus is on from a organizational leadership standpoint. Why do they care about this right now? Because I think that can help empower and engage you with your activities. And then I'm going to talk about a framework we use to work with that really goes through organizations and touches on different areas that need to be engaged in this. And I really think that there's no audience more appropriate than you all on GREE teams to look at this, because we really view climate change as climate action has to be driven up, down, and across organizations, and that your roles are absolutely vital to this. So while we focus our practice on board directors and executives, they actually are receiving a lot of their input from you. And maybe by understanding a little bit of what's on their minds and some ways of looking at how to engage different parts of your organization, that might help you do your work. And I have to say, I'm just thrilled to look at the list of people participating today, because you really come from so many different types of organizations: for-profit, not-for-profit, public sector organizations, and different roles. And this really supports, I think, what we all believe, which is that we all have a very meaningful role to play in this, and that by sharing best practices amongst us and through collaboration, which may not have been the strong suits of industry in the past, but really this is what's called for at this time in history. So we're delighted to be here. And Robbie, why don't you go ahead and tee up my first slide then to get us going.
Sure thing. There you go.
Okay, so this goal we talked about a moment ago that President Biden has announced actually, a lot of that was driven by business executives. Oddly enough, did you ever think that executives would be the ones to call for deep emissions cuts, for huge, huge, staggering climate action, even when they know that there actually might be some short-term impacts on their business? Corporate taxes might have to be increased to pay for some of this. But nonetheless, this number is now low. More and more corporate leaders are taking a very dramatic leadership example, both within their companies and with engaging with the public sector to call for action. So why is this? And this has happened relatively recently. So let's have the next slide and we can explore why this is happening. Well, one is it's about financials. And if you're leading an organization, one of the things you are feeling very painfully, like all of us as individuals, are these billion-dollar weather and climate events. Hey, all of us in Northern California are not strangers to this. We've experienced the wildfires over the past couple of years, and guess what? It's getting worse. The drought situation is getting worse. Then you see this devastating storms in Texas, floods, sea level rising. I mean, this, as you can see by the 2020 slope, it was looked at in August, but that is only accelerating up and to the right, and not in a good way. So what we're seeing is a really dramatic impact on the bottom line of organizations, and of course, all the communities that are supported by and engaged with those companies. So that's one trend. And of course, physical risks, like weather risks, are some of the most visceral and in your face types of climate change that we can see and experience. But as we'll see in a moment, they're certainly not the only ones. Robbie, next slide, please. So as we see, it's the financial impacts of climate change are definitely intensifying everywhere in the world that your organizations engage. But also popular attitudes are shifting. And part of it is because people are experiencing these impacts. And I think there's also an attitudinal shift that's going on about people wanting to engage, knowing they need to engage, knowing that they are change makers and that they're empowered to do that. So popular attitudes are shifting, and that's reflected in people like all of you who are employees at organizations. You are taking it upon yourselves to drive change in your companies. And very honestly, if you don't see that change occurring, if you're not seeing your organizations making the changes that you think are necessary, you're probably going to work elsewhere. And your organizations know that. And that's a huge pressure on your business leaders. You're also seeing it in your roles as consumers. People are voting with their pocketbook. They are embracing brands that are leading towards sustainable practices. And we're seeing whole shifts across industries. You've seen the incredible rise of the plant-based foods industry, among others. And that's driven by people who really care about bringing on more sustainable behaviors themselves and having that reflected in the world around them. So that is something that's incredibly important to business leaders, is customers and employees. And then the third one is world governments are acting. And up until recently, the US had been kind of a laggard in this area, and the EU and Asia were well ahead of us in terms of green practices and actually mandating that companies working there have to support those practices. So for some US companies, part of the reason that they've been driven towards sustainable practices is it's been part of their really license to operate in different geographies, that they would have to demonstrate their sustainable practices or not do business there. And now they're just seeing this in general. If they want to attract consumers around the world, if they want to have partnerships, they also have to be engaged with climate action. And so our government now is catching up on that. And actually, I'm very optimistic, because I think in the United States, we may be a little slow on the uptake sometimes, but when we act decisively and we act strongly. And I really see us coming back into the Paris Climate Accord and taking a strong global role in terms of climate action. And then the last one, for companies that have outside investors, they're really holding board directors accountable themselves for what's going on in the climate actions of their companies. And this is a change over the past year. Organizations like BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street, which account for about 80% of the asset management for privately held companies, or publicly held anyway, private sector companies, they're saying to the board directors, you can't just push this down in your organization and point to somebody else anymore. It's part of your job. Your job is to make sure that your organization is sustainable. And part of that is a big part of that is protecting yourself from climate risks. So as board directors and C-suite executives are feeling that pressure, they are making the changes and they're working with management and they're listening to their organizations to see what they need to do to drive change. Robbie, next slide. And because of that, and this is a quote that just astounds me from the SEC, there's been no historical precedent for the magnitude of the shift in investor focus that we've witnessed over the last decade towards the analysis and use of climate and other ESG risks and the impacts in investment decision-making. So basically what that translates to is companies will invest in, investors will place the money in organizations depending on what they see about ESG and climate actions. So that's really a very important trend line and something that organizations are really taking a view towards. And as a result, they have to disclose more, and we'll talk about that in a minute, but they have to tell people what they're doing and have real facts to support that. Robbie, next slide. So if you look at those investor organizations, this is just a laundry list of things they're looking at in terms of their priorities. And I know that, you know, a number of these are very familiar to you and things that you're already doing within your organizations, but it's kind of interesting to see how they rank them. And disclosures are really at the top of the list. And why that's important is even for companies that are just starting the path on climate action, it's important to start that. It's important to set a baseline and then be able to report back on progress. So even if I think companies have resisted reporting because they haven't had much to show, but we've actually seen through studies that companies that do report, even if they're coming from a very low baseline, are getting rewarded for their transparency, rewarded for their deciding to take action, even in advance of taking those actual actions. I will say, though, that greenwashing is no longer something that's viable for companies. People who are consumers of information have access to information as they never have before. They have ways of evaluating whether it's actual or whether it's fabricated. And so for most organizations, they do see a real risk in greenwashing, and they want to make sure that what they're doing is really quantifiable, it's very specific, and that they can report back on it. So let me just take a pause. I've said a lot there in the past couple of minutes, and I just wanted to tee this up for why you're maybe hearing and feeling more urgency from your top management. Those of you who've been on green teams for a while, this is really good news. It's hopefully you're going to get engagement and resourcing, maybe beyond which you've had in the past. So it's a real sea change that's happening at the senior management level. But let me take a moment and see if there are just any questions or thoughts or inputs at this point. Nope, everyone's in stunned silence. Okay, great. Well, we'll keep going, and you know, we'll definitely field questions and get your input on this later. And particularly in the breakout rooms, we'd really be interested in hearing how you're engaging with your management and any shifts you see there. So for now, let's go on. Robbie, let's have the next screen, if you okay. So here's how we suggest that organizations look at climate action. And what we've found typically is organizations may look at one or more of those areas, but often fail to look holistically at the problem because it really is enterprise-wide. And you know, as you talk to your colleagues in the breakout rooms, you'll hear a lot of different titles of people who are on green teams, and that's a good thing. So this is no longer about audit or the chief risk officer or finance or communications or any one of those things. It's really something that needs to be infused in every part of the enterprise through the strategies and plans of every part of the organization. So where we think organizations should really start is the idea of education. And that's, first of all, articulating that climate action is important so that everybody in the company knows that and has a consistent definition of what climate action means to that organization, and partly what their role should be, and encouraging roles to get involved in that. So there should be a baseline education, and we're encouraging organizations to offer that to everybody, um, maybe starting with the senior staff, but involving everybody in the organization, because everybody has a role to play in this. The next bucket is assessing risk. And as we talked about earlier, it's probably most likely that organizations have been looking at the physical risks of climate change, because those are the ones that have most visibility, often the highest dollar risk associated with them. Um, Organizations are looking at where their facilities should be located. If it's in a hurricane prone area or something subject to rising water, do you want to relocate that? How about your supply chain? If there are going to be areas that are under duress because of climate change, maybe you want to rethink your supply chain. So there's a lot that is very valid on the physical side. And luckily, there's some really good tools that are emerging now based on AI that let you, with great deal of specificity, look at locations around the world at different threat scenarios and measure that. But those aren't the only risks. We talked about reputation, and we've seen through the COVID pandemic that reputation is actually a huge risk area for companies. Organizations that were slow in responding to COVID, didn't adequately protect their employees, are coming out of this really with damaged brand reputation. And that's going to be around, that's really hard to come out of if that's happened to you as a company. Whereas those that responded well, took a leadership position, were very transparent, that offered support and flexibility for employees, they're coming at it with enhanced brands. And that's really what's going on with climate action too. And you're seeing organizations that have taken strong steps to advocate for climate action are doing well from a brand reputation standpoint, which really then translates into customers, employee wanting to be uh, engaged with that organization. So reputation around actual climate actions is a significant risk and opportunity. Another area is regulatory and policy risk and opportunity. And when I say risk, I always believe that there's a flip side of this, which is the opportunity side, because the risk is if you don't prepare, and the opportunity is if you are prepared and you can pivot and create services and products and ways of doing business in anticipation of that risk area. So as we're seeing right now, since January, there are a tremendous number of new legislative actions, policy changes, some that have already been enacted, others that are in the wings. And those will both carry carrots and sticks for organizations. Carrots in terms of maybe major tax benefits, maybe infrastructure investment, but also some regulatory risk for organizations that are not coming up to snuff in terms of their own emissions reductions, their carbon footprints, and others, particularly around the disclosures area. If organizations don't do those tasks, they're probably going to be penalized. And that's something that organizations have to take a look at. And then there's another area, which is really a community risk. And this is if companies are not engaging properly with the communities that where they're located and that engage with them, that those communities could, with a voice that they've never really had before, decide that they don't want those businesses to be located there. And this is something Bea will explore a little bit in her part of the conversation. Well, let's go on to purpose. Probably the biggest risk of all is what I call the existential risk, or the real threat that faced with climate change, that the underlying purpose or the assets of that organization are no longer valid. And you can think of whole swaths of industries that might feel that way right now. Could be traditional oil and gas players. It could be elements of the construction business, could be cement steel makers, a whole host of them. And the important thing here to do is to do some real soul searching, not be afraid to look at what your core mission and purpose is as an organization. Because if you do, and you see what your core assets are, it's very possible to find other ways of deploying those that are more consistent with the realities of the future that we see ourselves going into, because of climate change. And this is an area that Carrie is going to explore a bit, and she's been really focusing on in her practice as well. Then there's catalyzing the organization. And our discussion today is a perfect example of green teams, by their very nature, are working across an organization to try to engage and catalyze people for action. And in our conversation with Tracy, she'll talk about how you can partner with different parts of the organization, the human resources part of the organization, for one, to help enable and support your work. But the idea there is that everybody should be engaged in this. And there's some things that senior management and boards can do to really help out with that, which is sending clear messages about the importance of this work, having executive compensation tied to it, clear KPIs, and just also engagement, understanding what's going on throughout their organizations and making sure there's a flow of information all up and down and across the organization. And the final is communications. And there's a lot of talk these days about disclosure, which is a really important part of this. But that implies kind of a one-way communication. And to us, it's more important really to invite communications from all stakeholders so you can receive their point of view, both inside the organization and outside. So you're seeing coalitions start of companies that are, you wouldn't suspect, not only companies in the same industry, but across industries that have the same problem that they're trying to solve and can get really creative about it when they work beyond their own doors. And I'm just going to mention a little example here. It's not a Bay Area company, but it's one I've spoken with recently that I think is doing a really good job across all of these. And it's a food and beverage company, actually Molson Coors. Some of us have enjoyed their products in the past. And you can imagine that climate is a big issue for Molson Coors, particularly the water aspect, because that is really their essential ingredient. So what they've decided to do is that they have taken their role of chief sustainability officer, and they've actually combined it with enterprise risk management because they see the threat as being that strong. And that person within the company has actually, understanding the role of the entire organization in this, has put together a sustainability team that's driven by the sustainability group, but has representatives from throughout the organization that get together, and she's the conduit to take that information back into management. She reports into the general counsel, and then they report into the audit committee out of their board. But it's how, to me, a C-suite executive can really be that person who provides that catalyzing ingredient, provides the information flow back and forth for all the audiences who need it. And she's also been instrumental in starting collaborations outside of even the food and beverage industry to look at the water issue, and some pretty exciting stuff going on there. So that's just one model. There are many, and we'd love to hear from you how your organizations are looking at this, how you're engaging across one or many of these sectors, and what your roles are as Green Team members to help catalyze climate action. So I'm going to stop my portion there and turn it over to you. Are there any thoughts or questions at this point before we move on? Okay. Well, Robbie, with that, let's go on to Tracy. If you would bring her onto the screen, please. And it's my sincere pleasure to introduce you to my colleague, Tracy Edkins. Tracy joins us with a very distinguished career, having been the CHRO at a number of leading Bay Area organizations, including our mutual alma mater, Splunk. You guys may have heard of Splunk in the big data area. She's also served at eBay and at Starbucks Canada. She's originally hails from Canada. Tracy, I think in our conversations, you've told me a lot about how you see HR as a potential enabler of groups like Green Teams, employee resource groups, and others. So your talk, we'd like you to focus on really how Green Teams can engage with their executives, and that conversation based on your own experience. But before we jump into that, let's run a first poll and see where people on the call are currently in terms of executive engagement. If you guys would just take a moment to answer this poll, if you would, please. The answers are coming in. I love seeing this real time. Now, this is pretty cool. It looks like there's some pretty good executive engagement coming in, which doesn't really surprise me. Again, thinking Bay Area companies are pretty darn sophisticated and engaged with their employees. Okay, we'll take just another moment or two on this. Okay. All right. Well, thank you very much for this. And we'll certainly want to talk more about this topic. But again, it's not sufficient that executives are engaged on this topic, but it can really help when they are. So one of the things we're going to be talking about in the next couple of sections here is how we can help all of us on this call engage executives at companies and bring them into the discussion, and so they can empower us to do our work. Tracy, why don't you, again, why don't you talk a little bit about best practices and organizational structures you've seen that facilitate the flow of information and engagement between green teams and their executives, and maybe talk specifically about culture and incentives, if you would?
Yeah, happy to. Happy to be here, everybody. So my experience with green teams I lump it into experience I've also had with employee resource groups. And in my career, I've seen employee resource groups that have been incredibly powerful and very successful in influencing their organization and getting the outcomes that they're looking for. And then I've seen others that have struggled. And I think one of the things that I learned and was able to put into practice in my time at Splunk was really that enablement piece that Amanda was speaking about. And how do you really help to catalyze your organization to move forward? And the best advice that if I kind of summed up what I saw in play, I would say that first off, asking for sponsorship feels like the simplest thing. But sometimes people actually aim a little too low in their organization. Your executives truly are flattered when they are asked to sponsor. And so I would always start at the top. That's not how all the magic happens, and you guys know that better than anybody, but I would never be afraid to start at the top. The other thing that I've seen successful green teams and other ERGs do that I think really helps their cause is they help others help them. Be clear about what they can do to help you and make it easy for them to get engaged, to sponsor. Who's the individual in the organization that can make sure that you're getting top billing at the next all hands? Who's the individual in your organization that can ensure that your good work is being featured in your newsletter? Approach those people and make sure that they know what you're doing. That whole idea of be clear about what your successes are, what your mission is, but also where are you running into challenges? What's the platform in your organization that would allow you to make sure that all the employees can tap into what you're doing, what's going well and what's not going well? You just never know who's going to step up and help. One of the things that I think I learned the most in my 5 years with Starbucks was this ability to really tap into the passion of the employees. It's amazing the flywheel that can be created when you get the right people working with you on the right problems. The other thing that I would say is always be recruiting. Always make it easy for people to know how to get involved in your committee. And you just never know where that help might come from. So those are some of the best practices that I've seen. I would say that from an org structure perspective, you can leverage the org structure. You know who is probably most responsible for sustainability in your organization, and you can start there. But I wouldn't let your org structure stifle you if you've run into some walls, because you can get support from a variety of people. And it's really about making sure that people understand what you're working on, the problems that you're solving, and make it easy for them to join you. That would probably be my best advice. The other thing that I would say is that sometimes groups you always want to know about budget. Budget is a big issue, I would assume, for green teams. And sometimes you can start with the ask, never be afraid to ask, but a lot of times you need to be creative. And the people who have the budget to solve the big issues that your teams are going after, they may not actually allocate the money to you first, but if you're coming up with the right ideas and your agenda is solid, you'll find the money will flow later. So don't be afraid to ask, but don't get dissuaded when the budget isn't offered early. It can always come later once your strategy is clear and they see that you've got good momentum. So those are my comments with regards to best practices and org structure. With culture, I mean, culture is a very interesting piece. I think it's really important. If you're new to a company and you're really passionate about making a change with the Green Team and helping the company to be better and do better on this topic, do make sure that you understand the culture, because the culture will really impact what's the best way to get things done and what's the best way to make sure that your platform is out there and well understood. And embodying the values of the culture in how you put your strategy together can really help give you momentum in your efforts.
Thanks, Tracy. You know, I was also thinking as you were talking, I'm sure in many organizations there are lots of different employee resource groups, and there was a question that came up. Actually, it was just answered in chat about what those are. But basically, they're affinity groups, as I understand it, right? For people who are passionate about a topic and they want to see if there's something their organization can do about it. So, what do you see about alignment or interaction between different employee resource groups? Can that be helpful to each other too? I mean, even if the goals are a little bit different, but sometimes there is some overlap. And I'm guessing in particular, the topic about equity and diversity and some of those things that Bea will speak to as well.
Absolutely. And thank you, Patty, for answering that question, and apologies for using the slang. Yeah, so ERGs are employee resource groups. In a quick example, I've seen the power of these employee resource groups and how they can really take off, especially as I mentioned in my time at Starbucks. And so when I joined Splunk, for example, the only employee resource group that they had in place was Women in Tech. And it was a very, very impressive group, but they had no sponsorship and they had no way of getting any airtime in the organization. And so that was one of the first things there I lent my efforts, and not to manage them, but just to enable them. I think that when you have groups, whether it be your sustainability group or your HR group, if they try to manage it, it's not going to be helpful to you because they don't have the bandwidth to put in the kind of effort that you're already putting in. But what they should be responsible for is enabling you. And so one of the things that one of my team members and I did is we basically kind of created the platform. How do you set up an ERG? Where do these get advertised in the organization? How do you recruit to them? What are some sort of meeting in a box ideas that ERGs can leverage? And that just took off like wildfire. I think we had 10 ERGs within 18 months of us kind of launching this ERGs in a box idea. And what they self-organized, and each ERG would nominate a leader, and some of them had a term and they would rotate, but those leaders of the employee resource groups would meet to brainstorm and to share best practices on what was working and where they were getting their sponsorship. And it was very, very powerful. And also, you know, I found myself, it was a way for me to get to know employees in a different way and to sponsor employees and to help them in their career growth because I was meeting them through their ERG. So it actually ended up having career benefit for them as well.
Well, that's super cool. It doesn't surprise me you were doing so many innovative things, knowing you. But that's a great idea that human resources can provide some of the structure to enable these groups to at least be able to pour their knowledge and passion into something instead of starting from scratch. And so if you're a new person coming into an organization, how would you learn? Is there an actual posting of these organizations? I'm kind of thinking back to my college experience where you'd hear about all the different activities that would be available. Is that something that HR would do as part of the onboarding process?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for every company, obviously. I can only speak for the ones that it worked for, but I'm going to guess, Amanda, that this is all housed in some very easy to access landing page, because early in career college grads, this really matters. And you mentioned it in your conversation earlier. I think it's a draw if I know my children, when they graduate from university, it's going to matter to them that they're joining a company that cares about sustainability and cares about their causes, and they're going to evaluate those companies based on how set up are they to support that work internally. And so, for example, in our situation, we had a landing page where employees could go and they could see all of the employee resource groups. They could see the whole kit to how they could start their own and what they needed to get started. So you could come in as a brand new employee and actually start your own employee resource group, leveraging all the tools available to actually get your message out and then to start recruiting members. And it even gave you tips on how to think about who to approach in the executive suite to be your sponsor.
That's so cool. And I imagine it even starts before then. Going back to my Molson Coors example, I was told that 40% of their new employees are joining because of the sustainability practices of Molson Coors. So clearly they're using it as a recruiting tool as well to let them know that if they join, they can be part of this movement, which is exciting as well.
And very smart.
And very smart. I saw a question come up about examples of what green teams have accomplished. And I think we're going to be talking about that a little bit in the breakout sessions. That's where we'd really like to do some of that sharing of what you all are doing. And then we're going to share it back to the team as a whole. So maybe we'll just hold off on that part. Tracy, thank you very much for sharing your experience and your thoughts. And we look forward to hearing more in the Q&A and then also in the breakout sessions.
You bet. Thank you, Amanda.
So Robbie, we're going to turn over to B, if you will, please. So I'm very pleased to introduce again, for you, those of you who may have met B earlier, B Hui Ye. Close? Hui, yay! Terrific background on the topics of social justice, DEI, and climate justice, as we'll talk about in a moment. And from an industry standpoint, brings a lot of background in the energy industry, both with some of the majors in the traditional sector, but also with the renewable industry. And I guess from just a philosophical standpoint, the whole topic of intersectionality, which is a word you taught me about a year ago, and I now crops up everywhere, but it's something very near and dear to you. So let's get into that, but let's take a poll first and also get a sense of participants on the call today and see what your organizations are looking at in terms of social. That first sentence should say social justice. The word justice got truncated there, but organizations that have taken a stance on social justice. And then we're going to map this into how that works with climate justice. Okay. Very interesting. And again, not totally surprisingly, because it feels like the Silicon Valley is a pretty progressive part of the world. And so that there is this concern and stance on social issues is very much in keeping with that. Maybe just coming up to speed with specific programs targeting diversity, equity, inclusion. And I love the fact that it looks like this is a topic that is being embraced by you all as Green Team members. Something that that B is going to spend a little bit of time talking about today. So B, maybe you could talk to us your viewpoint on how social justice relates to climate action, and what are some ways that green teams can embrace that topic of social justice and include it in their work with that lens.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. And I think that is a big question, Amanda. How does social justice relate to climate action? Because there are two very large systemic challenges and institutionalized problems that I know all of you are quite familiar with on the climate side. And for me, the question really is, how does social justice not relate to climate action, right? When we look at climate in a one-dimensional lens that's focused on environmental protection and conservation, which is the origin of what we're celebrating today with Earth Day, we are actually missing the crux of the issue, which is that the planet will be fine no matter what. It's the people, it's us, it's the human race that's facing the consequences of many, many years of unsustainable institutionalized decisions that have created this existential threat to the quality of life that we're used to. And so when you put people at the center of the climate crisis, you start to see the challenges that it creates from a human rights lens. And I like to break it down into 3 questions to really help make that mental shift from more one-dimensional, environmentally focused climate action to a more human-centered view of climate justice work. So the first question is, who's being hurt? Who is being displaced? And if you've heard this term of environmental refugees or climate migrants, you know that to the tune of 1 billion people worldwide by 2050, they will be expected to move because of insufficient infrastructure that cannot withstand the changing climate and the impacts of that in their very homes. Of that 1 billion, 143 million people are coming from sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. That was from a 2018 World Bank report. And so, the numbers are only increasing. When you break that down a little bit more, 1/3 of these communities, mostly communities of color, are uprooted due to extreme weather events and natural disasters, a lot of the physical climate risk that, Amanda, you were pointing out in that climate framework. The other 2/3 are moving and forced to move due to humanitarian crises. But those are increasingly linked to and exacerbated by a changing climate, right? Desertification, sea level rise, ocean acidification, air pollution, loss of biodiversity, all of this puts incredible pressure and can destroy people's livelihoods, leading them to seek new places to live, new modes of working. And so when you take a step back and you think about who's being hurt, who's being displaced, who's being harmed first and worst, you're putting people at the center of the climate crisis, and you're seeing that it's communities, largely communities of color, BIPOC communities from the global South that are islanded and rural. So you can't really look at the climate crisis without first answering that question of who is being hurt. And the second question I like to think about to help with this mental shift of climate action to climate justice is who is doing the hurting and who has caused the harm. Unsurprisingly, Americans emit much more carbon dioxide per capita. It's a shocking 20 metric tons compared to the world average of 4 tons per person everywhere else on average in the world. And we also generate the most waste per person. I know a lot of you are probably familiar with the reasons behind that due to our heavy meat consumption, our transportation modes, just general consumerism in fast fashion, and the way that we are buying and disposing of products and goods. And I don't want to say that without also acknowledging that it's mostly due to heavy lobbying by the oil and gas industry to sustain enabling policies for the extractive activities and the reliance on fossil fuel that is creating this disproportionate carbon footprint from Americans in countries like the US. So we know that the people doing the harm and that the history of colonialism and imperialism and extractivism and all the other isms is the context in which all of this harm has been created, and displacing that burden and that responsibility of dealing with the climate crisis on the people who are being hurt, who we just talked about, right? And so this brings me to, because to do any work in sustainability, to do any work in climate, you have to be an optimist. You have to think about solutions. And I know everyone here today is a problem solver. That's why you do this on top of your day jobs. And so the third question is really, who is going to help? Who is responsible? How do we move forward? And I think the injustice at the crux of our climate crisis is that the countries and communities responsible for our climate crisis are bearing the least amount of harm from their actions, right? So it's clear that it's unfair and that it's unjust to ask countries of the global South and BIPOC communities, some right in our own backyards, who are hurting first and worst from climate change, to tackle that problem in the same way and in the same amounts that other countries who have caused this problem and contributed the most to it should be doing that. So that's hopefully a framework in centering people and asking who is being hurt, who is doing the hurting, who is responsible to move forward, that really grounds us in this aspect of why climate work is social justice work. And we can unpack that a little bit more.
You mentioned something a moment ago too that was, I mean, all of that is just so sobering and such an important lens that it's about the people. And maybe I would say not just the people, but all of the beings that rely on us also for the choices that we make as a human species. But let's talk about our own direct communities here. There's huge issues about the world around us. We have to think about those communities and in the products and services that we use as organizations so we can affect that. But how about the engagement with people right around us? So maybe you could talk a little bit about how this problem translates to climate justice issues that we may see in our own backyard.
Absolutely. I think that just bringing it back to our local systemic issues around racism and sort of the social reckoning that we've all gone through, starting with George Floyd's murder last summer, all the way up to, the conviction and trial yesterday. It's, I think, a lot to deal with, and it starts to make you realize that this isn't about global climate change and communities being impacted in places I've never been to. This is about how I show up to work, how I show up in my community, how I show up to my family, to my networks, and what I stand for. And if that is climate action, part of that must also be climate justice, right? Because as we've just talked about, you can't really bifurcate them. And if you do, you're actually perpetuating a lot of the status quo problems that have allowed us to say we're doing good climate work without thinking about the people orientation of that. So everywhere in anybody's backyard, if you look hard enough and with this framework of centering people and asking those 3 questions about whom, you will see traces of environmental racism. You will see the way that we have created very high risk living conditions because of a history of redlining, and that race is actually the biggest predictor of your health in America, not socioeconomic status, not genetics, but really just if you're Black, Indigenous, a person of color, you're very much more likely to be within a 10-mile radius of a polluting facility, and thus create, worse air, asthma conditions and health status that then compounds as you think about what you're able to do as you move through life. So it's another great question and another big question, but I think it's about localizing the problem all the way to what you can do personally in your climate action work that will connect the dots between climate and justice.
There's so much to talk about here. Maybe just one other quick question for you, B, would be, so for green teams, how can green teams within organizations make sure that they're being inclusive and that they're inviting all the right voices to participate? Not
Absolutely.
the right voices, that was pejorative term, all voices to participate.
Absolutely. So I think the first question is always ask yourself for whom you're doing this work. And if the answer to that is the planet, then I invite you to really think deeply about, okay, beyond the planet, again, the planet will heal itself. Mother Earth is incredibly resilient, right? Is it your consumers? Which consumers? Is it your employees? Which employees? Is it the stakeholders and partner groups? Is it your supply chain groups? Be super specific, and you can be hyper local in terms of who your green teams are helping. And it doesn't have to start hugely large and scalable. It can be, this green team is for this group of employees in the engineering function. But that's how you build a solid foundation of integrating people in your approach, and not, again, falling into the very easy pitfall of our green team is about protecting the planet, period. So asking yourself for whom, really sitting with that question, I think is the best practice. I think Flipping the script is another best practice in terms of a lot of the themes Amanda and Tracy have talked about, like doing less harm and shifting that to doing more good. I've seen this with, public sector organizations I've worked with, where we start with, like the city of Livermore in the Bay Area, right? We start with, we want to minimize your carbon footprint. We want to think about energy efficiency retrofits and renewable energy projects that we can implement. But then turning that away from just minimizing risk to how can we engage the community around sustainability? How can we support clean tech businesses that want to scale up their technology and implement it in your citywide programs? How can we bring youth into this conversation and show them this horizon of green jobs and a future industry that they can build capabilities around? So flipping the script in your green team from let's do less harm to where are the opportunities and how can we create that value for our business, our organization, our stakeholders, I think is another really great best practice to start to align more around climate justice.
Thanks so much, Bea. That's just, again, so much to think about, and can't wait to talk further with you and get other people's point of view on this climate justice aspect of climate action. But Robbie, let's turn it over now to the final one of our team members who's going to be speaking with us now, Carrie Haley. And actually, that's a perfect segue, Bea, because Carrie's going to be talking to us about, we tend to focus on mitigation, adaptation, but there's also this other area, which is innovation and maybe the opportunity to do things that create value, not just for a company, but also for the overall community. Carrie's background is she's worked on staggeringly huge capital intensive projects, which she can tell you a little bit about some of them, but taking a systems approach to complexity, trying to understand how things interoperate so that these projects can actually come to fruition. She's worked across the energy sector, infrastructure, and technology, among other areas. And it's going to be great to get your lens on this, Carrie. So let's take a quick poll first before we dive into your comments. And this is really about your organization's stance on whether you look at opportunities, not just the risks of climate change. And how do you as green teams get involved in that value creation exercise? So just take a moment on this poll, if you would, please. Well, this is interesting. This is really a pretty balanced view. It's coming out kind of all over the map, which is interesting and exciting. It'll be really exciting to hear from you all about some of the value added activities that you're exploring with your organizations and what they're involved in doing in terms of creating value. It feels to us as we're talking to business leaders that this is actually where they really start perking their ears up is, hey, are there new revenue streams? Are there new customer bases? Are there new products and services that we can offer? As well as, of course, avoiding the worst of the threats of climate action. So, Carrie, why don't we turn it over to you for a minute? And why don't you tell us from your experience a little bit about how you can of some of the areas of climate action and what organizations can do, some of the exciting projects that you've been involved in and how companies or other organizations can do this.
Great. Well, it's actually really a pleasure to come in at the end of this really robust conversation because we've gotten some amazing insight from Tracy as it relates to, organizationally, how do you galvanize the troops? How do you really get sponsorship and actually affect change internally and what that could do for individuals' careers, et cetera. And then, and the power of that is significant. And then shifting over to Bea, really looking at climate justice and understanding it through the lens of, who is being harmed, where are the opportunities. I think that's just, again, a really powerful means to consider that dimension. And as it relates to the work that I do, what I'm going to be focusing on are some of the applications that I've worked on. So the actual take, some of the problems and solution sets and applying them kind of out in the world. But one of the more recent additions, and partially because B has really been quite impactful, influential for me, is moving beyond the status quo of what a climate impact, alternative energy, electric vehicles, et cetera, all of that great news. But what's actually happening within the communities? How might we bring in a local lens to the impact for the communities and really engage them in a way that is a part of opportunities to work within the program, for example, problems that we might solve locally, conditions we might not have as a team thought about a few years ago, but very much bringing that lens into consideration for these very large projects. And I'm just going to cherry pick a couple of them because they're either very current or they're becoming current again. And what I mean by that is I work with a team whose vision was to really drive mass adoption of electric vehicles a little early. This was 2008. And we raised quite a substantial amount of investment. The company was called Better Place. Some of you may be familiar with it. We were unfortunately not successful for a variety of reasons, but the vision, the purpose, the idea was really spot on. We just were quite early because we needed to affect many layers of the systems with which we had to interact: policy, regulatory, utilities, grid management, EV, the battery composition, the OEM car manufacturers. I mean, there's sort of nobody that didn't have to be impacted and influenced. And when you take on that many stakeholders, it's a pretty challenging situation. But we learned a lot about where we could impact and really make change. And from that group, we have about 300 Better Placers who are around the world, who are our alumni network, who are involved in pretty much every company up and down the value chain around electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles, et cetera. So we believe with President Biden's leadership, of course, and Secretary Buttigieg particularly, that the time just might be right, that many of the solution sets that we had some tremendous vision around are actually implementable, and by not only those problems that we undertook at that time, they're still the same problems, and they're being now presented, funny thing, exactly the same way as we did 12 years ago. That's fantastic. But we want to add these other dimensions to be considering: how do you engage the stakeholders internally to help solve that problem? How do you engage the communities in which you're building? And my job always has a physical plant, physical assets attached to it, whether it's telecommunication networks, data centers, for example, very large, the hyperscale data center programs, oil and gas on and offshore, processing facilities, industrial processing, and currently doing a lot of work in the carbon capture and sequestration space. And there's quite, just a significant amount of activity in that. And what's actually great is to see the old industries of oil and gas taking a look at what are we really good at? What's one core expertise that we have, and how do we leverage that differently? And so Amanda asked, really, what is it how is it that a challenge can be converted into an opportunity? And I'll use this as a great example. Well, they're quite extraordinary in their the understanding of subsurface complexities. Well, how about using that expertise to support the sustainable at significant scale storage of CO2? How about really being able to impact that in a significant way? So just yesterday, I think it was, ExxonMobil, who of course brought you the large scale hydrocarbon extraction projects that we all are familiar with. They have announced a $100 billion initiative wanting to outreach in the Houston area to offset these significant emissions that are in and around that area. Now, they, I think, quite smartly attached a government engagement to that for it to be successful, because in the projects I'm currently working on, and they're fairly large scale, and we have some really interesting partnerships, and I'll get to that in a second, but the government regulatory structure is stunning how many agencies are involved, how complex it is. It remains a fairly Byzantine process from the federal to the state to the county to the municipal levels and everything in between. So you've got a really challenging regulatory environment, which, by the way, we faced back in the 2008 timeframe when we were looking at electric vehicle infrastructure, being able to deploy that across multiple countries simultaneously. And I know one of the folks on the call is from Hawaii, and we did actually, that was one of our test markets because it was an island economy, and we could really look to that infrastructure deployment in a fairly controlled manner. And Hawaii was very forward thinking about what they were going to do, helping us regulatorily, among other aspects. But the point is, without the government's involvement, you almost have no chance because the policies impact so much for these large programs that it's really my sincere hope, and those with whom I'm working, that the new administration and Secretary Buttigieg, who is right now involved in the infrastructure, inclusive of electric vehicle charging and autonomous vehicles, et cetera, that they leverage some of this thinking, and that some of these ideas can come together and these problems can be solved that weren't before, and that added dimension of the impact on the communities. What solve a business problem, that status quo, solve a business problem that incorporates the humans that are living around it in a sustainable, compelling way. That is the challenge set or the opportunity set that we're now seeing much more focus on.
And it could be that organizations that don't believe that they have anything to contribute in this area actually do. I mean, one example might be looking at a waste stream and saying, hey, that's not just garbage. There's something to be done with that garbage. Another area would be for tech companies that say, hey, we really don't, our carbon footprint isn't very big. Well, data centers and how, what's the role of technology companies actually in driving clean energy? So maybe you could touch briefly on both of those.
Yeah, absolutely. So, well, as it relates to the data centers and the tech companies, that's an excellent point. And the large tech companies, of course, all have, whether they sell those services to commercially as well as utilize these data centers for their own purposes, or whether it's solely an internal use network, they have massive footprints around the world for the data centers. And here we are, a distributed group here, leveraging the very technology we're talking about. We need those distributed facilities. We have to have that amount of bandwidth and compute power, et cetera, to do our work variously, to varying degrees. Well, if you saw how these data centers come together just on the basis of the construction, the installation, what's happening when these multiple crews come onto the site, the amount of packaging that ends up, the waste that is ending up at these large facilities it's kind of, it makes no sense. Like, who's not thinking from a procurement perspective or a engineering perspective? Get that packaging not at our site, figure out ways to solve that. I know that seems like an odd thing that is still an issue in 2021, but it's really quite stunning. The other is a preponderance of reliance on diesel gensets. So these diesel backup, generators that are not only at the data centers. Now, not all of them, but it's a significant opportunity set, as well as your telecom networks. There's many, many cellular towers that have these diesel generators. And depending on what region you are in the world, there's a lot of theft. There's all manner of challenges as it relates to it. So it's dirty, it's noisy, it's dangerous, and it just is not sustainable. And so having, for example, hydrogen fuel cells, which are very much being deployed currently in the US, particularly for several of the telecoms, it just makes good sense. It's smart business, they're longer lasting, there's all manner of things. So things as simple as that before you get to the more obvious, which is the use of renewable energy. And I definitely know that the large hyperscale data center providers are quite switched on to this and taking it very seriously. I think it's sometimes the obvious things that aren't as exciting to solve that actually have major impacts, like the diesel, generator backups. Like, let's solve some of the obvious things that don't need a PhD to figure it out, but they're quite widespread. So.
And along with that could be, just facility infrastructure and some of those things that we think about every day, or back when we're, when we're maybe back to traveling again, do we really need to take that flight? And can we do carbon offsetting? Can we have that as a practice within our companies? So there are a lot of things that are kind of subsurface, if you will, that actually add up to being pretty meaningful.
Yeah, and I just make two comments. One is the, we need to raise the bar as it relates to collaboration and creativity. So interesting partnerships that are out there, potentials for organizations to think about, what are we really good at? And how might that differently applied provide a solution? And by the way, are there some, interesting partnerships out there? So one carbon capture project I note is this collaboration between Schlumberger, which is a large oil field services company in the oil and gas sector. It's Chevron, large oil and gas company, and it's Microsoft, big technology company. Very interesting partnership. So you'll see more of them. The ExxonMobil announcement's another good example. So we need to raise the bar on collaboration and creativity, and we have to lower the bar as it relates to our target. It shouldn't anymore be carbon neutral. It should be carbon negative. We're using the wrong N. It's negative. We should be aspirationally getting to that, because just hitting neutral is not going to get us where we need to go. And obviously not all industries can hit that, but I think just as a goal, that's really where we need to be. So lower the bar. That's my phrase.
We're talking regeneration now. So
yeah.
Carrie, thank you so much for your thoughts. And
Absolutely.
gosh, there's so much we could all say. We get so passionate and excited about what we're talking about. But we really wanted to turn the mic back to Robbie to engage us with some Q&A at this point, and then do the breakout rooms, because the whole point of the session is really engagement and interaction. We just wanted to set ourselves up as telling you a little bit about who we are, so that we can field some of your questions and then learn from you. So Robbie, back to you.
Thank you, Amanda. Yeah, for the sake of time, I think I'm only going to ask 2 questions so we can spend more time together in the breakout rooms. So this first one is, as companies look to leveraging their core expertise and finding opportunities to support initiatives that are pro-climate and environment, is there concern about the effect on their bottom line?
Thank you. Why don't I field that one? And I'll try to be brief. Yes, absolutely. So business leaders are trying very hard now to balance the need of their stakeholders. So that's been a big shift. There used to be shareholders. Now it is stakeholders. And for some it's lip service, but I think there's an increasing realization that stakeholders like employees and customers actually lend themselves to impacts on the bottom line. So even if you were a business leader just looking at the bottom line, you've got to look at that more holistically than you used to, because you have an informed, engaged set of stakeholders. So yes, that's true. But what you're seeing is a real change at the board level. You're having people being brought on board that are longer term thinkers, strategists, not just people who are coming out of straight finance or accounting backgrounds, but just different mindset too, because companies are looking at how they're going to be sustainable writ large over the next decades, and not just over the next quarter. So I think you'll find an increasing look at how to make themselves sustainable in every aspect of that word.
Great, thank you, Amanda. And then this one was addressed for B. It says, from the work that you are doing with companies, are they starting to connect the dots more between social justice and climate justice? Or are you still seeing quite a discrepancy between the two?
Thanks for that question. Definitely seeing, I think, the bridging between more one-dimensional, environmentally focused climate action to how can we show up as corporate citizens that bridge that gap to things like social impact, social justice, racial equity. I've been doing a lot of work with the outdoor industry lately, and REI is a great example where they've said climate and racial equity are the 2 topics that we are really focused on. We don't have a lot of, capability to the points that Carrie was making about where do we even begin to wrap our arms around such a systemic problem that's institutionalized in so many of the ways that we operate our business and that governments work. But they are looking within to what is the existing infrastructure, what standards do we have around products, how can we make our marketing more inclusive, and showing that climate and racial equity can be two of your biggest priorities and serve each other in the way that you're moving forward. So absolutely, yes, seeing a shift in that. And I think it can start from the top. It can certainly start from green teams and employees throughout the organization, like all of you.
Thanks for sharing. Okay, everyone, I am going to launch the breakout rooms. Please make sure that someone volunteers to either take notes or mental notes at least about your conversations, that when we all return, we can share our discussions. You should be receiving a pop-up now on your screen. Okay, that's okay. We can move on. Thank you for participating today. I wanted to give one more shout out to Plan C advisors, our keynote, and our panelists. Incredibly insightful, and I really value everything that you were able to talk about today. So I'm going to put this in a follow-up email as well. So if you don't have time to write it down, don't worry. But if you're interested in learning more about Plan C services and you'd like to get in touch with one of their representatives, you can email, and I hope I'm pronouncing this last name correctly, ayoshida@plancadvisors.com. And Patty over at Acterra is also going to be pasting the links to Plan C services on their website. So please feel free to take a look at those. With that being said, we will follow up with an email and a recording of this event if you weren't able to attend for all of it, or if you had to jump in and out, and information more about our network. Amanda, do you have any closing remarks before we sign off?
No, just thank you so much for the opportunity. I wasn't really aware before, if a friend of mine who may be on this call, a former board member of Acterra, introduced me to you guys about a year ago, and I'm just so impressed with the work of the organization and inspired by the work of the Green Team. So I'd really love to know more and how we can collaborate with you and really help from, all different aspects of the organization drive change, because that's really what's required. So thank you again for the opportunity.
Of course, we appreciate it. Have a great day, everyone. Happy Earth Day. Celebrate our planet. And until next time.